انفجار ثاني وانفجارات كبيرة وهائلة، وربما هذا ما أشار له المسؤولون العسكريون.
The United States is in a state of confusion and surprise.
We fear this. We fear that they have something out that majority of the people don't know about.
Olan tüm halkların hakları gibi haklar. Ne aşağı ne yukarı, ne fazla ne az.
Pent-up feelings that may result from decades of repression and people who've had members of their family killed by that regime.
A lot of killers. Get a lot of killers. Why you think our country's so innocent?
But I won't attack it because someone sicks me on. I don't let anybody use me to fight their battles.
Welcome to Varn Blog Solo. I have decided not to do a stream anymore for these discussions that I do with the ether. Partly because my interaction with the audience can often go very sour very quickly. Partly because I think these things build parasocial relationships that are not entirely healthy. And partly because the scattered nature of responding to comments leads to me rarely actually completing my thought, leading a scattered appearance where critiques are often started but not finished. And thus, you can insert whatever you think I meant at the end of said critique. Now, I wanted to do a response to Jacobin's most recent, The Left in Purgatory, and Matt Christman's recent appearance on Diet Soap, both his public one and his Sublation Media Parrot Room chat. And of course, you would need to have listened to the Parrot Room to get the chat, and that requires you to be a patron of Sublation Media, and that is, your choice. I'm not going to take clips from that and incorporate it since it's behind a paywall, but I will talk about it another time. I'm going to recreate part of the stream I did earlier for the general public, however. And this will be how Varn Blog Solos go out, just like Nailing It Down pieces, that they will be like this with no stream. This may lead to them being shorter and with less vitality, but they will hopefully be much more focused. Today, I'm going to focus, however, on the NPC meeting for the DSA for February 5th and 6th, 2022. There is going to be a spring recommitment drive because of a significant drop in monthly membership income. This led to an audit where it was realized that 12,000 members had expired and 7,000 members had lapsed in the DSA in the last 6 months between when the convention happened and this NPC meeting. You can find this all in the DSA Observer Rundown of the meeting. These are all things that are available. The finance staff over at the DSA cited a significant drop in the monthly membership income, and notice that finance staff will be withholding due shares from chapters who do not complete compliance and audit paperwork. For those of you who don't know how the dues are split in the DSA, and many members don't, for the dues you pay directly to the national, 80% of them will go to the national, and 20% will go back to the local. There are other expenditures allotted, based on any number of things, but that is the general split, and you can find that. I believe there's a document that was on a Patreon feed for the DSA that went into what the split was. Regardless, however, the 100,000 number has seen a drop in a fifth in less than a year. The reason why seems to be general malaise, a lack of national orientation, and an inability to figure out what the DSA is doing outside of being downstream from the Democrats. Its ability to make inroads outside of, regional hubs of progressivism places that I like to joke you could run a shoe with a D on it and probably win, is becoming clearer and clearer despite some early gains for DSA candidates in purplish cities in red states. Now let's go into the actual details of this MPC meeting. The general gist of this is that the MPC needs a recommitment drive, but needs a national focus for that drive. They also feel like while there's an increasing need for bureaucracy and the expansion of bureaucracy, that several of the MPC members realize that you can't get people to recommit just to the DSA's internal bureaucracy, and they need exciting projects to fund and participate in. But what are those exciting projects going to be? The Democrats stand to lose the midterm elections by even moderate accounts, and while the Democrats have restructured many districts towards more stable seats and less competitive elections, something that they have done in coordination with Republicans. So you can tell that both parties care about expanse, but their expanse at the local level, from the national perspective, is at maintaining current member stability, not really at expanding their reach. This is also probably a side effect of nonpartisan commissions, which can easily do that as a compromise between both parties without appearing to make a whole lot of competitive districts. Well, this means that there's very little for the DSA to invest in, except for things like pushing the Green New Deal Round 52, pushing the PRO Act. There's very little call for Medicare for All out of there, particularly as it was made an issue with the Force the Vote campaign earlier in the last year. Now, I would go so far as to say the problem with this is a systemic lack of accountability between both the locals and the MPC. After all, the national program and its working committees has expanded greatly with the membership, but there's been no intervening organizations, regional level coordinators, etc., to actually create the coordination between the locals and the national, and this was by design from Harrington way back. This means that increasingly also there's a weird mixture of volunteer and paid staff, and then electoral staff that is semi-paid or given a stipend for their time. This is the kind of stuff you see in unions, but at least it's the kind of problems you see in business unions, where the paid staff is increasingly professional organizers who are really more like professional lobbyists. And then the electoral staff has its own electoral concerns to maintain with. This has led to the creation of factions and the importance of factions in the DSA. And in fact, the caucuses, which are essentially the replication of basically microsects, to use Hal Draper's term, within the DSA itself, in order to serve as the kind of intermediary between the DSA and all the other major all the other major locals. The Jamal Bowman affair has probably made this worse, and we'll get to that in a minute. So, according to the DSA's own caucuses, though, your dominant caucuses are Bread and Roses, Green New Deal, Renewal, and Socialist Majority. With Class Unity, Marxist Unity Slate, which wasn't even listed, Tempest, Socialist Alternative, which were both Tempest being basically the remnants of a lot of the ISO, and Socialist Alternative being the Socialist Alternative tendency within the DSA, as Socialist Alternative itself has declined in membership to about 1,000 according to its own records. And then Reform and Revolution and Class Unity Caucus. The Libertarian Socialist Caucus has, even though it's one of the oldest of these caucuses, is increasingly not particularly important. And there are other caucuses that have existed who aren't even particularly involved, such as the Communist Caucus, which had some of its origins, I believe, in the Marxist Center, which also dissolved this year. So many of these organizations have liquidated into the DSA to increase their access to numbers and resources at the very moment where the DSA's resources and accesses drop. This is predictable and should have been predicted. After all, a grassroots movement that intends to change a party can only continue to grow if there's a chance that it will actually change the party. Otherwise, it will be converted into the party like the Tea Party was into the conservative Republicans. Although some people see a direct line between them and Trump, and that line is not there. And furthermore, part has had to do with the focus on national level campaigns without growing either working class or regional institutions. This is hardly deniable, and yet you don't see a big push for this even within the DSA's NPC. Now, this is all quite boring if you're not in the DSA, but for those who are out here, what you're seeing here also is, except for the international Marxist tendency, the decline of worldwide Trotskyism. You see the increase of highly devoted, highly radicalized individuals into small Marxist-Leninist parties, our internet movements, such as the Patriotic Socialist Movement, the counter signal against the DSA. But as for the real numbers or real influence, it's hard to tell what they actually are. You cannot judge commitment based off of even superficial engagement online. We have to ask ourselves then, what is actually going on here? And let's go back to the rundown document. I will link this document from the DSA Observer Substack, which is a free Substack. You don't have to pay for any of its articles. So you can get the information if you're interested in the actual breakdown. One thing that the DSA NPC, and that's is concerned about is getting locals to be more attached to national priorities, but it's unclear what the national priorities are outside of Democratic primaries. And this electoral focus has not decreased with the failure of the Squad and other progressive caucus members to really affect the Democratic Party in its current unity, but actually show that it matters less and less, as came up in the article that is going to be run by Natalie Shore on the seemingly decline of the popularity of AOC amongst the Democratic Socialist left. Now, the organization has a budget, according to itself, of $6.9 million, which for 100,000 people with regular dues seems a little low to me, but it's hard to say. We'd have to compare it to similar sized organizations on the left, and there aren't many. All the increased stuff around staffing this year, which has to do in unions, has to do with growth and recommitment drive, was freezing the labor, GND, and electoral work according to the top priorities, focusing on electoral primaries with particular emphasis on MPSA identified cadre candidates, so more people like Jamal Bowman who won't listen to the DSA's own platform, because after all, the DSA doesn't really have the money to really matter. Hiring staffers to begin a component of the DSLC's work, and hiring labor staffers to SALT for Amazon and Starbucks unionization. The priorities came with an outreach plan that was passed by the MPC. There's a 5-year growth plan, which involves building infrastructure to allow for a plurality of chapters to participate in big national projects, although they're unclear about what those projects would be, addressing challenges of having volunteer leaders overseeing non-political unelected staff, which is increasingly a large part of the DSA. We should look at the historical parallels to the SPD and to the CPUSA. where you also had the increasing number of unelected paid staff. Now, in the SPUSA, it was actually used to move a lot of black radicals into the middle class and to support black arts, but often as kind of agitprop for the USSR. But it was a way that you could make a middle class living working for the CPUSA, particularly as a minority in the 40s and 50s. That's why the CPUSA produced such artists as Lorraine Hansberry and Paul Robeson. This also led to a lot of backlash, though, and a lot of accusations that the CPUSA was not interested in the advancement of black people, but just an advancement of certain kinds of black artists for its own goal. This was a substrain in the work of Ralph Ellison, for example, and was also something that the late Harry Cruz accused the CPUSA of doing. With the SPD, you had them increasingly invested in actually running a government, but breaking with second international standards that while one should participate in parliamentarism, one should not govern a capitalist state without being able to identify and implement a minimum program. But in the case of Germany, that never happened. So what you had is an increasing bureaucracy, which to do all the para-electoral functions of the SPD, while the SPD was actually overseeing, sometimes even, crushing workers' movement under the Hilferding theory that monopolization of capital would lead to the ability to democratically seize the commanding heights of production. This generated a lot of backlash. Unemployed workers ran to the Communist Party because they did not feel like they were being protected by the SPD. Often this also led to Catholic and Protestant tensions, which I've never really quite understood how they manifested in the SPD versus the KPD, but I have read that they did. Secondly, a lot of the working poor, people who were effectively petit bourgeois, were able to eke out a living, became increasingly attracted to the pretty proprietor programs of the fascist and their loose monetary programs, all while being very angry that the SPD was taking workers' money to build an increasingly elaborate staff. Now, this mirrors what happened actually with the American trade union movement, and I can do a whole video on that another day. The reason why I bring these two counterexamples up, though, is we're beginning to see these bureaucratic tendencies in a negative way in the DSA at the very moment it starts to lose its large national base. 21,000 members in an organization of 100,000 is 1/5 of the membership. And remember that this is likely to be a low estimate because it takes 6 months to a year to even be counted as what's the official terminology that they use, as expired, and almost 2 years to be counted as lapsed. Furthermore, this is not dealing with the fact that meeting attendance is probably significantly lower than that, and that meetings never generally had more than 1/5 of any local in attendance except for very small locals. But you can see that what the national growth plan has indicated is to further inculcate locals into the national and to try to bridge the gap. Now, like many left organizations, the viability between a plurality of organizations and a national organization that doesn't necessarily always take accountability for the locals leads to quick growth, but also little responsibility. And one can give the DSA a pat on the back for boring the failures of organizations that propped up around Occupy and organizations that propped up around Black Lives Matter that have had no accountability and transparency and have often had multiple organizations representing the movement in a given locality, often leading to confusion about who's responsible for what. This has led to some big money scandals now that has even been reported in the New York Times. Luckily, because the DSA structure was set up by Harrington in an earlier time when such diffusion/NGOism was not quite as big a deal, and since the since franchisation of locals has not really been in a DSA model, we have not seen that. But what is the expansion of the DSA $6.9 million budget going to do? Well, this I'll actually read from the report on DSA Observer, but I will add my own commentary here. The MPC passed a 2022 budget of over $6.9 million. This budget comes to vote at the end of the months-long process where the national formations were asked to provide annual budget requests. The budgets went through the Budget and Finance Committee, which made the recommendations to the MPC. X noted that this budget comprises of a doubling for national committees and working groups over previous budgets. So you have a double budget despite declining membership at the national level. However, many of the funding requests by the national working groups were rejected by the National Budget and Finance Committee. Notably, that budget includes a $300,000 for Resolution 30, strengthening the DSA from the bottom up through national matching funds for chapters to hire staff and open offices. The MPC will focus on funding office spaces for chapters as staffing reaches legal questions related to the National DSA Staffers Union contracts and other issues. However, the MPC brought forward several floor amendments overriding the recommendation of the Board of the Finance Committee to increase the budget over $200,000. Major additions that passed, along with smaller consent items, were an increased budget for multi-chapter gatherings of $222,000, an increase of the Green New Deal funding by $1,800 to bring the total Green New Deal amount to $5,500 to match the PRO-ACT budget, which also $5,500 for Congress is nothing, and an increase of the NEC budget by $127,500. Sorry, but $127,500 to give grants to nationally endorsed campaigns. All right, the NEC budget required the most discussion. X, and I'm not giving names here, that's in the report though, stated that grants would come in amounts of a maximum of $7,500. Again, unless you're running in a very small city, that's not a lot of money. This amount would allow for 17 grants at maximum. So the NEC is to help local candidates, I believe. And while this may play an amount in a not particularly contested local city council election, in a contested one, that's not any money at all. So what I'm getting here is it's a lot of money for the DSA to give up, but not a lot to really aid in its ability to influence candidates. Right? Proponents of the amendment cited the desire to invest national resources into our electoral priority and, as X stated, stand behind our candidates. So we're going to see a doubling down in the electoral strategy from the DSA at the moment when its memberships are declining. Others cited concerns about lack of compliance guidance, ambiguity in the amounts chosen, and a concrete plan around to use this funding. X also noted a concern that the MPC is putting cart before the horse and providing these funds without a broader discussion of electoral strategy, particularly when other national working groups were denied funding under the belt tightening. Different X, noted that any implementation would follow compliance guidance to come from staff. X, a third different X, requested clarification on how the number $7,500 was chosen and whether it was based on anything specific. X explained that it was not. It's just a division of the money they were able to get. XM put forward an amendment to amend the cut in the amount to half because of budgetary concerns. This sub-amendment failed. And then the last thing the MPC addressed is their own accountability. Now, I will shorten this, and what they were saying that they proposed was the MPC was to refrain from engaging in any harassing, abusive, or retaliatory behavior as outlined in Resolution 33 at the last convention. Refrain from using retaliatory behavior, including confidentiality breaches or organizing to avoid accountability, including public shaming, maintaining confidentiality and impartiality around grievances, and refrain from accusations and name-calling publicly. The proposal put forth consequences to breach, which included using mediation to work through MPC conflicts, revolving access to confidential information and participation in executive session, and suspension or expulsion if a member is found to have breached confidentiality or interfered in a grievance process, censoring, suspicion, or removal from the MPC. What you will note is lacking from here is any recall of the MPC by the popular vote for any perceived threat to the larger DSA. This is mostly about protecting the legal organization of the MPC and maintaining the guidance of unity. And particularly, this is because of the tensions that arose over the Jamel Bowman voting to provide Israel with funding for the Iron Dome missile system, despite the fact that the DSA's platform forbids this and endorses BDS explicitly, not just in the creation of the working group, but also something that most of the DSA can agree on. Something that almost all the caucuses and most of the membership largely agree on, and their decision not to expel Representative Bowman was actually unpopular amongst the vast majority of DSA membership. The DSA membership and the National are not accountable to each other, and this is quite clear in this decision. Largely what we see is a continued NGOization of the left and the inability for things to break out spontaneously. The other microsects have largely declined in favor of low-commitment internet movements, which can give people the feeling of rush without having much actual organization. The same, actually, as many of the low-commitment hashtag movements that began in the aught-teens. This is important to understand. This is a failing strategy, particularly as tied to the Husk parties in the United States. The parties in the United States have never been mass membership parties. They were not the mass membership parties that emerged from Germany in the workers' movements of the 19th and 20th century, and they are also not the largely legislative-only parties of the British, which were the first party systems, such as the Whigs and the early Tories. With the American party system as a hollowed-out Husk party, with a large national apparatus and the state apparatus floating out slowly. But if you actually know that the state apparatus of the Democrats, for example, in many red states is barely existent. Even in purple states such as Florida or Georgia, the Democrats often have no local power on the ground and are often playing against the national where the majority of the resources go. And this way, the DSA is only recapitulating the problems of the Husk Party of the United States. But the other thing that the DSA has to do that the Husk parties don't, being that they are private corporations, is that the DSA is not a private corporation, but a nonprofit. Such nonprofits have other things they have to comply with, and they have their own bureaucratic mandates as by law. These require perpetual staffing and more use of resources. And until you understand that, you won't understand why the NGOization of the American left has been such a problem. This is a result of a sclerotic left that overinvested in a national campaign because it had no other options, and now still cannot imagine how to use an electoral strategy to really build up institutions. In fact, over time, it builds up more and more into the electoral strategy itself because that is expensive. But since it can't really compete with larger donors and things and other things like businesses and private donations, it really isn't an effective strategy there either. If you want the DSA to thrive and survive, you will have to address these issues, and this will mean going into the DSA on a footing to fundamentally change the organization. Do you think you will be welcome if you do that? I personally would not spend my energy and effort on that any more than I would spend my energy and effort on a live stream with a hostile audience. And with that, good night.